Welcome to the WTS. My name is Steve Ramsey. The goal with this podcast is to bring you quality conversations with people at the top of their fields, people with unique artistic visions and worldviews, people with practical building skills, and creative people with engaging personalities. If you listen to the WTS regularly and you find these conversations stimulating, educational, provocative, inspiring, or simply entertaining, please consider becoming a WTS Plus member over on Patreon. I've got a plus now, Grady.
Nice.
Everybody has a
Everyone
plus.
needs a plus.
Yeah. Producing this podcast is completely a one-man show, and I sure could use your help. You can sign up right now over at patreon.com/the WTS and check out the benefits. I'll also include a link in the show description wherever you're listening to this. Hey, head over there, if nothing else, just to check out the cool artwork that my son Wyatt designed for the banner. I think he really captured the eclectic mix of this podcast. Thanks a lot for supporting this show. Grady Hillhouse is a civil engineer and creator of Practical Engineering, a YouTube channel devoted to explaining the man-made infrastructure of the world surrounding us. His videos teach us about how aquifers and dams work, or how water towers supply our homes with water. You'll learn about the importance of culverts, how pavement works, and how electrical transmission lines and traffic signals work. This just scratches the surface. Practical Engineering is one of those channels that posts must-see videos every time. And I'm not alone in this. Each video gets well over 1 million views. It seems like they're always trending. That's pretty cool. His video about how sinkholes form is just sitting at a cool 12 million views right now. I think sinkholes, it's one of those subjects that just strikes a raw nerve with all
really
of us.
does.
You know, everybody's like, what? Yes, what is it with the sinkholes? Today, the channel is closing in on 3 million subscribers. Wow. And in case you didn't know, it all started as a humble little old woodworking channel.
That's right. That is right.
Grady's first book, Engineering in Plain Sight, an illustrated field guide to the construction environment, which is set to release on November 1st, is already the Amazon #1 bestseller in home design, buildings, and construction. Did you know that?
I didn't know about that category. It's hard to keep track of all the different categories.
How many pre-orders have you taken for the book?
I only know how many have bought from my website. I'm not sure about publisher or Amazon. Amazon will tell me once afterwards, but right now they don't. So I think my publisher knows, but I haven't asked them in a while.
It's safe to say like well over 1 million, I'm sure.
I wish. I'm very happy with the number. I'll just say that.
I'll bet. You gonna send me a copy?
Of course.
Good. It looks like a really cool book. I can't wait to read it. So a recent video on Practical Engineering was all about debunking construction myths, a topic I thought would be a lot of fun to talk about on this podcast. And while we're at it, I'll throw in some of my own woodworking myths. Grady, it is great to see you again.
Yeah, you too, Steve. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that super generous introduction. That's so nice.
When we last chatted, I think you were getting used to being a new father and being a full-time YouTuber. So what's life been like since? It's been like a year since we talked, I think.
Yeah, probably a year and a half, because I am a new father once again. I have a 9-week-old baby at home, so things
those are close together.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah, they're just under 2 years. So,
Wow.
So yeah, I'm not getting a lot of sleep right now.
Is the new one a boy or a girl?
Another boy.
Okay, so you have 2 sons.
Yep, that's right.
Wow. So are you happy that you were able to quit your day job and become a YouTuber, or is there times now when you think, man, I kind of like to
I mean, yeah,
peace?
There's a certain amount of stability that you definitely get from a day job, but also the flexibility of, kids get sick, all kinds of crazy stuff happens when you have kids, and it's just nice to be able to step away and go help mom or whatever.
Right. Wow. Hey, let me ask you this question before we get started on this. What kind of a person should pursue civil engineering? What kind of a personality does that take? Do you have to be just a mathematician or what?
No, not really. I mean, the higher level, of course, you have to get through those classes, but most civil engineers will hardly use, higher calculus and stuff like that. In kind of the realm of all engineering, civil engineering, I think, is more geared toward, it's more of a generalist thing. You kind of have to have those social skills to, give presentations to big clients and hold public meetings and things like that. You kind of have to have your sales hat on sometimes to sell the projects, and you also have to have the technical skills. So it's a hard question to answer, but I think maybe it's a little more for people who aren't necessarily hardcore engineers, although within civil engineering there are definitely that type of person. But I think there's probably more room for like field work, like construction sites and stuff like that. There's more room for being more on the business side of things. And yeah, also if you just like really, really big projects, civil engineering is probably one of the only careers where you can see your work on Google Earth. So there's that too.
That's pretty cool. How do you define civil engineering?
It's really about infrastructure. So it's kind of like the big projects that meet humanity's basic needs. So transportation, water, wastewater, air quality, the power grid the power grid kind of straddles electrical engineering and civil engineering. But yeah, it's really like the big stuff is civil.
And buildings? Any buildings?
Yeah, so buildings again straddles kind of architecture and civil engineering because structural engineering is a part of civil engineering. So anything that has a structural design, that's usually a civil engineer.
I live just outside of San Francisco in that Millennium Tower.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm keeping track of that one. Such an interesting
You had a
story.
video on this thing.
Yeah, and things have changed a lot ever since
even
since that I made that video. Things have changed a lot.
Yeah. So this building is, I don't know how many stories tall. I guess it's a combined residential office space.
I think it's just condos, just residential.
Is it just condos?
I'm not positive.
And people are still living there. People are still living in it. And the thing is tilting over. I think at this point it's like at a 45-degree angle or something. I don't know. But it's sinking. Mm-hmm. And it's just every time I see something new on it, they're like, yes, we figured out how we're going to fix this. It's only going to cost, $30 billion or whatever. And then the next report, I'm like, well, that didn't work. Man. It's sinking some more.
Yeah, it's been a...
Do you have any insight?
Well, I mean, it's just a bad foundation design, but I mean, there's a lot of other mitigating factors that go into it. There was a big lawsuit that settled out, and this, I think the city ended up paying for some of the costs to the retrofits because they dewatered the soils for one of their projects adjacent to the building. It's a big mess, and I mean, you could talk about it for hours and hours, but as they've tried to retrofit the building to slow down the settlement, that construction, like the vibration and the disturbance, has accelerated the sinking. And so they're trying to balance this. We gotta fix it, but we can't do it so aggressively that we make it worse in the process. And so it's been a heck of an adventure. And I don't know if it's been a while since I checked the news about it, but I don't know if they've got it figured out yet.
Do you think ultimately it might have to just come down?
I kind of doubt that's going to be the case. I mean, it seems really bad when you hear about it, but that the actual tilt of the building, it's out of plumb. I can't remember by, I think less than 10 feet, which 10 feet seems like a lot to be out of plumb, but for a building that high, my house isn't even that level. So the people who live in the building probably don't even notice it.
Yeah.
But that it is a lot of settlement, and there are consequences to that, like how it sits next to the adjacent roadways and how it connects to the utilities and all those different pieces that go to a building. The settlement matters there, so it'll be interesting to hear what comes out of it.
before I get into these myths, I wanted to ask you, if you're setting up a town, let's say you're setting up a town from scratch, Gradyville, okay? You've got a blank canvas to deal with. What would be the order of projects in an ideal world to get an infrastructure running?
Oh my goodness. That's a tough call.
In 30 seconds or less. No.
Yeah. Design a whole city.
I mean, would you start with like water, right? Wouldn't that be like the primary? You'd want it on a river or something. And
Yeah. You need a water supply. You need electricity. You probably need to manage wastewater, although a lot of smaller cities, or not city, I would say smaller towns or more rural areas, people just have their own personal septic tanks on and leach fields on their property. But probably in any populated area, you need a way to manage wastewater.
And it would make sense to start that from the beginning, though, don't you think? Or am I just crazy? You would want to, because then you have access to the underground laying pipes and whatnot.
Yeah, because you need roads for a city too, and you know, sewers pretty much have to be underground. Water lines kind of have to too, especially if you're in a climate that has freezing. Power lines don't, obviously, but yeah, you don't want to tear up a brand new road to install utilities. And most subsurface utilities run under the streets rather than under people's private property, and I mean that's just because you don't want to deal with property issues every time you need to repair a line or fix something. So yeah, you don't want to go tearing up streets to install brand new water lines if you don't have to. So it's best to start at the bottom and work your way vertically. That's what I'd say.
Would you go solar right from the start?
I mean, it depends on where your city is. If you're in one of the major power interconnections in the U.S. or elsewhere, it makes more sense to connect directly to the existing power grid. Although there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out about microgrids and the resiliency to wide scale outages of power infrastructure. Being able to compartmentalize a small group of power users to create kind of a microgrid. If you want to pay for the batteries, then solar is a nice choice. But batteries are expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could look at my own house as an example of that. We got the solar panels a few years ago. We got a good tax rebate or something on it. It was a real good incentive to install those. And they pretty much fully power our house now. We get a bill every month. The PG&E sends us a bill, I guess, just to use their lines. There's like a fee because solar, I used to think, oh, you have solar, you're like off the grid, and you can be, but most people aren't. So what you are is you have these solar panels, and then we feed it into the grid, and then they basically give it back to us, is how I think how it works.
Yeah, that is true. And a lot of utilities offer that for you they'll pay you for the electricity you put onto the grid. But there's a lot to that too, because that infrastructure is expensive, and the rate that you pay for electricity covers that, but the rate that your utility provider pays you for the electricity you put on the grid doesn't necessarily take that into account. So just the fact that your power demands don't exactly match the power supply that's in your house requires that you be connected to the grid, and you you depend on the world's biggest machine essentially.
And they send you there's like a true up at the end of the year where, depending on if you've used more of their electricity that you haven't generated enough, or if you've generated more, they actually give you a little bit of a refund on that. So that's sort of how it works. But we looked into getting the batteries, because when we were having these power outages a few years ago, I was just so pissed off. I'm like, God damn it, I don't want this anymore. And so I was all set to get the Tesla power packs, but wow, those things are expensive. And then I started just looking at them like, it just doesn't make sense. I can just get a generator if the power goes out and at least power some things, but I don't know.
Yeah, reliability is such an interesting thing, because it's like that last 0.5% is the hardest one to scrape out of the system. And it's like how much how much of an outage can you bear, and what are you willing to pay for that last tiny little slice of reliability for power supply and any type, any
Right.
basic human need.
Well, it was a frustrating situation because they were still they're called PS or something like that, outages, where they're planned outages for if it gets windy or something and the wildfires, and so they shut down the power. And they only did it that 1 year. It was like 3 or 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it hit us for like 3 days with no power. There's other communities had much longer waits, and they say that they're trying to improve that, and that's not going to happen as drastically anymore. But I don't know. And everybody was frustrated because the power went off, and they're like, well, how do they not handle wind? How was wind enough? And especially because the wind wouldn't necessarily be like where you are at my house. It's like, well, it's not windy here. What are they talking about? Why do they need to shut it down? I don't know.
Yeah, that's such an interesting case study. I'd like to cover that more in a video, because I don't know of any other like transmission providers that face that exposure to liabilities of starting a wildfire, basically. And I mean, It's just a risk thing that the infrastructure is such that a spark could cause a wildfire and they could be held liable for that. And so that exposure to the risk, they had to calculate that versus the frustration of all their customers, and I don't know if it was the right decision. I don't know all the details about it, but it really is an interesting case study because, it's quite complicated and there's a lot of uncertainty involved on both sides.
I know that Pacific Gas and Electric became like the most hated company in the state for a long time.
I heard from a lot of people about it at the time. Man.
And the best place to be was Costco. Costco had a full generator running. They were the only place that was open, so everybody was going to Costco. And they were like, nice. Yeah, come on in. We got everything running here. We're cool.
Yeah.
All right, hey, let's get into these myths. I just thought this was the coolest video because, and you kind of straddle this line between white collar and blue collar work. I think that's really cool. How you you're kind of an advocate for both sides of this equation. You've got the engineering and you've got the guy on the street, shoveling dirt.
I try my best. I still get called out a little bit about it, but I spent nearly 10 years as an engineering consultant, and I spent a lot of time on construction sites, and I was never the laborer. I wasn't ever even the this construction superintendent, but I interface with those guys all the time, and I feel like at least I kind of know a little bit what it's like to be in that world. And people call me out as as a desk jockey or whatever, and I was that for a lot. But it was nice to see both worlds, and I do try my best on the channel to show both sides of that world because I think that's important.
Is it generally a good interaction on construction sites when somebody from the office walks into a site, or an engineer or somebody like that? Is it okay, or is there a little animosity there?
It really depends on the site. There's kind of this just like the feud between architects and engineers. There's also kind of the feud between engineers and construction contractors, and some of it's deserved, right? Because we do both live in our own worlds by necessity. That's just the way it works. Like, if you knew everything about what it took to build something and everything it took to design it, like you could do it all, but no one would hire you because, just because of the way contracting works in most in most public sector projects. So the engineers they aren't that familiar with how things get built, and yet they're charged with the design of a project. And so to a certain extent, you have to do that without really knowing what's going to be easiest or simplest or most cost effective on the contractor side. And on the other side of the coin, the contractor knows the best way to build it, the simplest, the easiest, and the most cost effective, but they don't really completely fully grasp the constraints and the engineering that went into the project. And so there's always a level of disconnect there, and it can create animosity. But in reality, most construction sites that I've been on have been very collaborative. The relationships have been really good. And, I still have a lot of heavy civil contractors that I talk to regularly. When I have a question about something, I'm happy to give them a call because we're buddies now. And so that's just an example of, how things can be.
I would imagine you just have to rely on the other profession's expertise for everything. I wouldn't expect, a civil engineer to be determining, I need a number 8 screw for this exact spot rather than, whereas the guy on the field probably knows what the exact.
Yeah. And where to draw that line is, I mean, it's the source of endless debate, especially because most heavy civil projects are bid competitively using the lowest bid model. And so in order to do that and to expect good quality work at the end of the project, the engineer really does have to specify a lot more detail than they necessarily have any good reason to do, other than you can't guarantee quality at the end if you don't go to that level of detail. And hopefully we're moving away from that, but that is, as you said,
that's a great segue into your number 3. We'll start with number 3. How about that? Since we were talking about this lowest bidder business, this was on your myths video about construction myths. Lowest bidder equals lowest quality. I've heard that before.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of people saying that.
And I mean, there's so much qualification that has to be done to these myths, but if the myth were really spelled out in full detail, say the lowest bid that meets the qualification requirements, it doesn't necessarily equal the lowest quality. But it's just, I mean, I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize why we contract big projects that way. And, it really is just to make sure that government officials, engineers, and contractors are all doing our best to be good stewards of public funds. And, that it's a way to eliminate, cronyism and handshake deals and stuff like that, where the public doesn't really know what's going on. Most heavy civil projects that your city or your water utility or whatever public entity represents you could go to the bid opening and listen, see the contractor's bids and listen and see who gets awarded the contract right there. Like, it's a very transparent process. And I think a lot of people don't quite realize that. And that's not to say, there is still a lot of cronyism in construction, but there is a lot of transparency too. And if you're willing to look for it, and I think people don't quite realize that.
I think when we see construction being done, at least where I live, it seems to always be the one big company that seems to always be doing. It's Gelati Brothers here in Marin County, and it's their trucks are everywhere. And I think, are they the only ones bidding on these projects, or is it just they get them every single time?
Yeah, I mean, I have never lived in that world of having to bid on jobs, but I have had to try to come up with my own estimate of how much things are going to cost. And it is so hard to do that. Prices of materials change all the time. Every project is completely unique, is going to require different construction methods and different equipment. And, maybe this crane's not available in this area, so you're going to have to ship one from halfway across the U.S. There's just like a million variables that go into the cost of a project, and to have to, before you even get started on construction, to have to sit there and estimate, this is how much it's going to cost me, and then sign your name on that line and say, if you hire me to build this project, here's how much I'm going to charge you, period. That's hard work. I mean, it's very risky and complicated. And of course, there are change orders that happen on nearly every construction project, and those can be a source of kind of making up for lost ground in the original bid. But for the most part, the low bid model it's just challenging on the contractor side. It's hard to bid those jobs, and it makes sense that there are some contractors in every area that kind of figure out the system. They reduce their level of uncertainty about how much it's going to cost, and so they can they can kind of nail that cost a little bit better than newcomers.
Right. And I would imagine that the corners they're going to cut, they're not going to put themselves or the business at jeopardy by cutting corners and making things unsafe or anything. So the quality will still be there. They're just probably a little more clever at finding those areas to shave costs.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the whole point of why we do it, right? Is so that contractors can look at a design, look at a set of drawings and specifications, and try to come up with innovative ways to get the work done within those boundaries, try to come up with cost-effective ways of doing that. And so they can lower their bid and be the one who wins the work. I mean, that's the whole point of it. Is it's meant to create efficiencies.
Man, I can't even imagine what a contract would be like to say build a freeway. I mean, just it must be huge. Everything. There's so many people involved and so many details to work out. It's mind-boggling to me. It really is.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's a fascinating world, and you could spend your whole career working on cost estimating on the contractor side or the civil engineering side, because I mean, in the end, cost is what everyone cares about, and so. Like it's important from every single point of view, from the owner to the engineer to the contractor to everyone.
Yeah, and to the taxpayer.
To the taxpayer too, exactly.
Bitching about how much these things cost. Yeah. All right. Okay. The number one thing on your video, construction myths, and I think this one really just struck a chord with viewers. When you're looking through the comments, it's mostly on this one, and it's in your thumbnail even, and because we've all seen this, it's like. Construction workers just sit around. That's all they do. Because you see that. You're driving and you see the cliches of like, oh, there's 4 guys standing around and 1 guy doing the work.
Oh, yeah.
Set us straight.
Well, I mean, there's just so much to construction. I mean, the biggest thing that I was really trying to communicate is that, like, construction is hard work. If you're out there in the field, you're not just collecting a paycheck. Like you're busting your butt, and if you're not, you get cut from a job site. And of course, there are a million caveats to everything, but there's a few things. Construction logistically is very difficult, so it is very much a hurry up and wait thing. You get the right machine in the right place at the right time. It's just. To coordinate all these different moving parts is complicated, and that means that there are some inefficiencies in how labor gets used. You do end up waiting for things to happen sometimes, but when it's your turn, you're busting it. And then
I think we're just driving around, and we're only seeing this one little moment in an entire day.
Yeah. So there's definitely a confirmation bias thing happening where when you kind of believe that this is the way the world works, you start to see it everywhere. But if you go out on a construction site, and for the most part, you're going to see that, there's definitely some standing around and sitting around, but it's not out of laziness, and it's not really out of inefficiency either, because it's just the way construction works logistically. Is people are not shoveling dirt 100% of the time, and they couldn't do it anyway.
Supplies or whatever. Yeah, it's just physically, it would just be too demanding. You have to do that. I love the very end of that segment where you mentioned if somebody came to your office, they may see you standing around the water cooler.
Yeah, that's just a joke that it's easy to see what's going on a construction site. Anyone can take a look. And I love that about construction sites. But if we could take a look at any other career field, you'd see similar inefficiencies and similar, what some might call laziness, but really I don't think necessarily is that. It could be, everyone needs a break from hard work, whether it's hard work with your mind or hard work on a computer or hard work shoveling dirt out on a construction site.
Yeah, I remember working in an office years ago, and there was so much of that, just like, standing around waiting for things to be done. And you just don't see that when you are in the office, because people aren't driving by your office and watching you work.
Another thing I didn't really have time to go into, but a lot of times even if you don't necessarily need all the labor on that site, it doesn't make sense to move people around. Like contractors often have multiple projects going at once. It doesn't make sense to move people from place to place on a day-by-day basis, because there's a certain level of overhead associated with, getting that person familiar with what's going on or anything like that. So again, it has to do with the logistics of construction, but it's just like anything, you can't match the supply with demand absolutely perfectly. And so there's always going to be some mismatches in labor supply versus demand on a construction site.
Yeah. And I guarantee there's no business owner who is paying people to stand around all the time. That's just not, he wouldn't stay in business. So he knows what he's doing with his money and where it's going, and the guys are taking breaks.
Yeah.
That's how it is. I think that, hey, next time you're driving past a road construction site, cut those guys some slack. Man, that is some hard work. I mean, they got to be out there all day long, and especially with the motorists out there who are griping and whining about how it's cutting into their day. Yeah, you're not out there pouring asphalt in 100-degree weather. This is a next one you have on here. I love this one, really, because I remember my grandfather used to say this to me. He used to say, like, because he would be so angry about the roads or potholes or something. He goes, God, they used to build roads in Rome that would last 1,000 years, And this came to your myth, is that ancient Roman roads and concrete were better than they are today.
Yeah, this is, I don't know. I think this is so pervasive, and I get the comment all the time. And part of it is like this belief that, longevity equals quality. And that, in a lot of cases that is true, but where we draw that line of how much we're willing to pay for something, especially infrastructure, versus how long it lasts, is a pretty complicated question. And for the most part, if taxpayers could really take a step back and look at how we allocate costs to projects, and how we prioritize projects and things like that, I think they'd understand better that there is a certain point where it does not make sense to make something last longer, whether we know in the future it's going to have to be upgraded anyway, like a bridge doesn't have to be widened or anything like that, or it just doesn't make sense to gold plate where it's not necessary. Those funds can be better used on something more important.
We've got hundreds of thousands of miles of roads to make in this country. It's not like Rome, where it was smallish compared to what we're trying to do today. And I think part of this myth is sort of implying that we no longer have the skill or the desire to do this.
Right.
We can certainly make stone roads that would last thousands of years, but can you imagine how much that would cost to make this kind of infrastructure using those materials? It's outrageous. You couldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly right. That it is possible to make things that last a very, very long time, but the resources required to do so is just, especially when you're talking about public funds, it's not worth it. Those monies can be better spent elsewhere. Essentially, that was kind of the gist of that whole that myth. There's so much that goes into that. The other part, I think, people is they just want to believe that. I'm not sure why, but that there's this secret that we lost to time, and there are there have been some interesting studies about the chemical constituents of Roman concrete, and there definitely are some interesting properties that have to do with seawater and stuff like that. But the truth is that modern concrete mixes are so far beyond what the Romans could ever hope to achieve. For all objective measures of concrete performance, we can beat it, and I think that's something that people don't quite understand. Like it's you want to believe that the Romans, had us outclassed, I guess, but it's really not true.
Yeah. It's a very romantic notion.
Yeah.
Romantic, I guess. Last one on your list was foundations must go to bedrock. Is this what we're seeing in the Millennium Tower in San Francisco?
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of I came up with these myths, mainly from comments and emails that I've gotten over ever since I started covering engineering topics on the channel. And that was a big one on the Millennium Tower. Everyone acted like it was so self-evident that the piers at the Millennium Tower should have gone to quote unquote bedrock. And so part of that myth is there's really no definition of what is quote unquote bedrock, and it differs between, depending on what you're trying to do. But also, engineers can come up with deep foundations or shallow foundations that don't necessarily go all the way to bedrock, that perform just fine, that meet every performance requirement you'd ever ask of a foundation. So that was the main thing. I was trying to just point out that it's not quite as simple as it sounds to just say, yeah, we go to bedrock. Bedrock is it's a shortcut to stability that it doesn't necessarily exist in all places, and doesn't necessarily always make sense in all places either.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people understand how much of San Francisco is landfill down there. It was like, if you look at old, maps of San Francisco, the whole 5 blocks down on the end of Market Street wasn't there. And this was all built up in there. The whole Marina District, where we saw most of the damage from the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. Even though on news it looked like all of San Francisco was on fire, it was really mostly confined to the Marina District because it's all flat, and it was all built on
fill.
I guess rubble they used from just different types of fill.
And that was a comment too that a lot of people pointed out. And I included the cross-sectional profile of that building in that video because you can see a lot of people talk about how San Francisco is all landfill, but it was like this thin layer at the very top of the map. The foundation piers in the Millennium Tower go to a very, very dense layer of sand. The problem is there's a really big layer of clay below that dense layer of sand that when it loses water, it loses elevation as well.
So I got a couple of my own myths I want to throw in here. First one is, and this sort of goes along with the ancient Roman roads were better, is that, and this is another one you still hear from people, is that they don't build them like they used to. Like houses used to be built better. And the strange thing is that I can remember people in the 80s saying, houses used to be much better built. And now people are looking at houses in the 80s and going, man, they just don't make them like that anymore. And I think what we're seeing here is kind of comes down to cost benefit kind of thing. And especially in more recent houses, that it sort of, we have these status demands on how we live. And so we want these McMansions, but we don't want to pay for the best materials in there. So we use okay materials. But I also think that a lot of the materials we're using today are, without a doubt, better than they were 50 or 40 years ago.
There's a lot of things about houses that have improved. The building codes have improved significantly. Yeah. And pretty much all of that is based on lessons learned about, things that didn't go so well in the past. But I think it's true too that, the further back you go, the more there was kind of overbuilding to compensate for this uncertainty about how long things last or how strong things are. And now we've kind of sharpened that pencil and we can get closer to that line without having to overdo it. But you're right too, that it all depends on what people are willing to pay for. And the thing is, if you want a house that's got, a 2-foot thick slab of concrete below it and, 2x6 interior walls, you can find those houses. But they cost a lot more.
It's going to cost you a lot of money, and that's what it is. We want to live like that. We just don't want to pay for it. So we have MDF cabinets, and that's another thing. I see people always complaining about, oh, the cabinets are so cheaply made. They're just out of MDF, and I think, well, it's a pretty good material, really. I mean, it's stable. They're painted. They're going to be there for a while. I don't know. We just, I guess, assume that, well, if it's not made out of solid oak, it's no good.
Well, I put out a video about foundations, and I was repairing my house's foundation, which was originally cedar piers, literally cedar trunks of trees that were driven into the ground, and that's what my house sat on.
Wow. And
that was done in, I think, 1946, and so they had to be replaced 75 years later. And I kind of posed the question on that video, like, how much more would you be willing to pay for a foundation that lasted 100 years versus 50? Like, how long are you going to live in that house? And when you go to sell it to the next person who's going to live in it, how much of a premium are they going to be willing to pay for the longevity of the foundation system? Probably not any. As long as it's going to last, as long as they're not going to have to fix it, they couldn't care less about how long that foundation's going to last. And so it's like this luck of the draw thing with houses, where as long as you're not the one who has to replace it, then you don't care. You're not going to pay extra for it.
Have you seen these? This is another myth. Thankfully, it's starting to get exposed more and more. Are these primitive construction channels on YouTube?
Yeah,
it's like this Vietnamese guy with a stick, and he makes this enormous swimming pool and like side little places, and these get huge views. There's like several of these channels now, and it's complete bullshit. None of this is true. It's like there's videos showing, oh yeah, you can see where like the backhoe marks were and everything. So I guess they've got like these entire teams that work on these things, and then they go in and they shoot the one guy with his stick making.
Yeah, so interesting. Content creation is a weird world.
Well, there is one primitive technology channel though, is really good, and that's
he really did.
He really does the stuff, and he's actually showing. You can see what it's like to really do it, as opposed to what these guys are trying to do. But it's really weird. It's like this strange cabal over there. But I also think that we have this tendency to exoticize Asian construction, and it's kind of, you see this in woodworking too, where you'll see some of these woodworking channels, the joinery, and it's like this soft music, and that somehow we equate that these guys can make these amazing joinery with and they're always barefoot, using and I just think that they're playing into this Western notion of I don't know what we think of as these like somehow all-knowing Asian culture that knows things that we just don't. We can't grasp.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it kind of goes in that same vein of the Roman concrete thing. Like somehow we're just missing out.
Oh, here's one I was thinking of is demolition. Because this is a big thing right now. People are remodeling their homes, and it's all over these channels on TV, HGTV and whatever, where they're going to remodel a house, and they always have this demo day because that's the big flashy thing they want to show. And they come in there with sledgehammers and they just start ripping things apart. And I think this isn't really how this happens. For one thing, if you're going to be demolishing a house, there's a lot of that you're going to be kind of more tedious about. You're going to be probably removing cabinets. There's no need to just bust out windows and have to clean up glass all over the place.
Yeah, if you're renovating, you don't want to be hitting your house with a sledgehammer. Get a Sawzall. You could do a lot less damage.
Let's see if I can go through a few of these woodworking ones I came up with. Probably the biggest one that woodworkers face is that woodworking and lumber is destroying forests. This whole idea of save a tree, don't
build a chair,
I guess, or something. I don't know, but I've had this comment a lot of times on my channel. How like it's just destroying, because I think people have a misunderstanding of how we get lumber.
Yeah.
Because you see the stories from South America where they've gone for exotic wood and they've clear cut forests and things, and they kind of apply that to US and Canadian lumber. And it's just simply not the case. It's a harvested crop, just like any other.
Forestry is such an interesting industry. But so yeah, I mean that's interesting that you get that comment. I remember when I was making woodworking videos, I was so nervous to use exotic woods because I did not understand where those trees came from and what was ethical to use. I tried to research, but it's so complicated and confusing. And so I remember feeling really nervous about those exotic trees. But I mean, yeah, especially being in the US.
Yeah, they've got some industry standards, I think, that are starting to form about how lumber companies bring wood into the U.S. and it has to be certified, kind of like the coffee growers thing, you know, how they have to be certified about how it was harvested and this sort of thing. But, you know, U.S. lumber, when you're buying a 2x4, the more 2x4s you buy, the pretty much the more trees they're going to plant.
Yeah.
It's kind of like any other crop. And you always see these companies that are like, save a tree, go E. Well, although I do think the E billing is really handy and everything, you're really not saving a tree because by using paper, the more paper you use, they're just going to make more.
It's still a resource, and if you have the opportunity not to use it, then
building with wood is probably the most sustainable way to build. Really, it takes a lot less energy.
Yeah, for materials.
Sure. So I asked some of my viewers. I had a community question on there asking them what they thought some of the woodworking myths are, and one of them was woodworking projects need to be built to last forever. This goes along with kind of what we've been talking about. Like the true test of a woodworking project or piece of furniture is its strength, and really there couldn't be anything further from the truth. It needs to be strong enough that it's not going to collapse when you sit in a chair, but you also have to consider the aesthetics of it. I mean, anybody could make a really strong chair out of just like hobbling together some 2x4s, but I don't know. You got to make those compromises.
Also, you know, there's a good chance you're going to have to move that at some point in your life. You might regret making it, overdoing it.
So the biggest one in the past year is Patrick Sullivan. This guy posted this research he did on YouTube about how strong end grain gluing is. Okay, so this has always been a thing that, you know, end grain is like the weakest joint that you can possibly do. So he did these studies on it and busted the myth that end grain is weak to glue, end grain to end grain, and that it's actually stronger than other joints. And through a series of tests, he kind of proved this. But this is what I like to call a myth, sort of, because like technically I understand what he was saying. He's right, but there's never going to be an opportunity really to glue end grain to end grain. When would you ever want to do that? Unless you're trying to make a really long board, I guess you could possibly do that. Yeah. But so it's not something that really comes up. The myth, quote, myth that people are saying don't use end grain joints is where they're talking about gluing an end grain to the face grain of a board. You know, if you're gluing two boards together, that is not going to hold, period. I've tried it. It just won't work. And so I think that's what people have in their minds is like, well, you know, now you can glue end grains. It's just fine.
Interesting.
Well, no, not really. End grain to end grain maybe, but you're never going to glue end grain to end grain. It's not a thing.
Yeah, an end grain to face grain fails because of wood movement, right? Because they expand and contract at different rates. Yeah,
and that end of the board just kind of soaks up the glue, and there's just not enough there's some ways around it. But apparently when you do the end grain to end grain, you can actually get a tight bond. So I would like to call that a myth.
I like that.
It's been busted, and I'm kind of busting the bust of it.
I like that.
And it's like, stop it. People always love to send me that. You can glue end grain. Well, you just try that, Dan.
That's awesome.
The other one people mentioned a lot, this is also a woodworking myth, is you should never store a hand plane on its sole. You should always set it on its side. There's this fear that you're going to like ruin the blade or something, when that's exactly what it's intended to do, is to shave wood with that blade. It isn't going to hurt it at all. It's just, that's its job.
Nice. The one I was thinking of, and it's kind of a myth, I guess. I feel like it's pretty popular for like someone to look at a piece of furniture you can buy from a store and then like add up all the costs that would go into building that project and compare the two and be like, woodworking is so cheap. Like I could get the furniture for my house or whatever, and they fail to account for, all the tools and the time that it takes and all the mistakes you're going to make. And I mean, the reality is most woodworking projects are not worth, if you don't account for the personal enjoyment that goes into the process, they aren't necessarily worth the trouble.
Absolutely not. Yeah, don't get into woodworking because you want to save money. I got into it years and years ago. I got into brewing my own beer, and that was my excuse. I'm going to save money by brewing my own beer. No, it's a huge, huge hobby. So tell me about this book you got coming out here. I'm really excited to read this and to see it. How did it come about? And kind of tell me more about it.
Yeah, I mean, writing a book is something I've kind of always wanted to do. And so I started kind of thinking about it more seriously as the channel started to grow. And I noticed that the channel was starting to move toward what I would call infrastructure you can see, which is like, giving people the opportunity to make a connection to things in their built environment that they didn't know what it was or didn't know how it worked or anything like that. And so that was the idea for the book, was like, okay, there's field guides to birds and rocks and cactuses and all that. Cacti, I guess you would say. Why isn't there a field guide to human-made structures? And so that was kind of how the book became a reality. And so there's 8 chapters, and they go through kind of different segments of the constructed environment, from roadways, railways, power grid, water and wastewater, stuff like that. And yeah, just kind of gives a brief overview of how these different things work and what they are. And it's totally illustrated. So every section of the book, of which I think there are 49 sections total, has a full page illustration with all the labels pointing at what everything is. And then each section also at the end has a little keep an eye out for like more interesting things that if you're paying attention you might notice in the constructed environment. So there's tons of illustrations all throughout the book.
Tell me something that I'm going to read in there that's just going to blow my mind.
Oh man, that's a tough question. I mean, it kind of depends on what you're familiar with and what you're not, but I love the little box sections at the end of each section of the book, because there are little things that, maybe you've noticed a little pipe coming up out of the ground with a curved shape in it and always wondered what that is. So
what is that thing?
Like talk about automatic air release valves and how bubbles get trapped in pipes and how we get them out of there, stuff like that. I love stuff like that. I mean, when I was going to school for civil engineering, every class that I took was like this lamp turning on to some part of the world that I had never noticed before. And that feeling, I just remember just being so amazed by that there was so much to the constructed environment that I had never even noticed and was so deliberate. And so that was my goal with the book, is to really turn on that lamp for other people and show like how much thought and care goes into just about every part of what we build.
What do you think is the most unnoticed thing that we see every day?
Oh, that's a tough
people
call.
Walk past and never even pay attention.
Maybe
to.
One thing I think is cool, and a lot of people probably have noticed it, but if you look closely at roads, you think of a road as a nice flat surface on which you drive, but almost all roads are curved. They have a crown at the top so that rainwater flows to the edges and keeps the roadway dry. And that's just one of those things that if you never paid attention, you would never even notice. But if you're building the road, you better do it this way, because we know that's what works best.
Water is like the biggest source of damage for everything, it seems like.
That's
Seems like it all comes down to water, doesn't it?
It really does. I love water.
That's kind of your specialty, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I studied in school. And when I worked as a civil engineer, I mainly worked on dams and water supply systems.
So what was the process of writing that book like? Was it stressful, or did you really enjoy it? And did the publisher approach you, or did you approach the publisher?
No, I wrote a proposal and kind of fleshed out the book, wrote a first chapter. And at first I was approaching literary agents, trying to get, one of the bigger publishers interested in the book. I never could get an agent that interested in, and I didn't take it that far before I found my publisher, No Starch Press. And they're kind of a boutique publisher that focuses on kind of geeky books. They do a lot of programming stuff. And actually, it was recommended to me by another YouTuber, Ben Krasnow from Applied Science. He said, you should submit it to them. And so I did. And I think it was within an hour they responded and said, we love this idea. We want to make this book. Let's get on a call and talk about it. And yeah, working with them has been awesome because they get it. They understood what I was trying to do with the book. So that was wonderful. The writing process and the illustrating process itself was fun, but it was also stressful because, we did have a deadline, and it's a big book. It's got a lot of illustrations and a lot of words. So it was a lot of work over the past year to get it ready, but it was fun too.
Is that a target audience? Is it for younger people, or is it any age?
I really did try to make it any age. Like that, just like I do my videos, I try to make it as broad as possible to attract as big an audience as possible. And I tried to do that with the book too. Yeah. The illustrations are kind of cartoony, and that was deliberate to make it more approachable. Like I didn't want it to look like technical diagrams and stuff like that. And there's even a little character who shows up in the illustrations doing kind of clumsy stuff. So it's kind of hard to nail down where the reading level is, but I would say like maybe high school and up or middle school and up.
I'm looking forward to it. I think the last time I talked to you, I mentioned Modern Marvels. Used to be a show I watched on
Modern Marvels. Yeah.
History. You watched that? Yeah. And I think you're taking over that.
I like that. I'll take that compliment.
Now. Yeah, I loved it. I never will forget watching that show. And then one time the next episode coming was on tarmacs, airports. And I thought, why? I'm not going to watch this. And I started watching it, and I just got totally drawn into this thing. And I remember every episode was like that. It could take the most mundane subject, and it would just make it exciting. And that's the way I feel about your channel. I think it's really cool that you can, because how many people are going, why is this pothole in my street?
Yeah.
And there's Grady showing us how that thing got formed. And it comes down to water, doesn't it?
That potholes, it's all about water. Sinkholes too.
Man. Yeah, the water just destroys everything. Yep. Oh. Grady, it was great talking to you again. I'm glad you could join me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always so fun to chat.